Hi there. Today I want to talk to you about a book I only finished last night, which had me awake for hours after wondering, why am I so obsessed? Will I ever be able to fall asleep again? So, join me in the madness that is House of Leaves by Mark C. Danielewski. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and yes, today we're talking about House of Leaves, a book I've been wanting to read for ages and which I actually started back in October when I finally found a copy in a bookstore and thought, okay, now is the time. This book has just appeared and I am going to read it. And then the person behind the till as I was paying was like, yes, I love this book as well. It's a great book. Enjoy. And then I started reading and I realized this is a book that needs time. It's also a book that deserves time and focus especially. And I didn't have that in October. I didn't have it in November, December, January, February, March, April, May. But this month, for some reason, it turns out I did have that focus. So I went back to it. And good Lord, what a book. So I'm going to try and explain in this episode, not necessarily what the book is about, because I think House of Leaves is a book that it's best to go into relatively blind so that each page can surprise you. But I am going to tell you about what the book is like, what it requires from you as a reading experience, because House of Leaves is not a normal book. It's not just page after page of text and then you're done. It is a super complex construction site, and it requires time and focus. So that's what we're going to do. I will give you just a brief overview of what the book is technically about, but I'm going to keep it short. There's going to be no expansive plot summary here. You can technically find that on Wikipedia and stuff if you just want to know what the book is about. But if you feel like you might want to read this book one day, you should go in blind. You should willingly enter the dark. That is House of Leaves. Okay, but let's get into some of what the story might be about. So House of Leaves is a book that is made up of a variety of different frameworks. So on the one hand, it is an epistolary book or epistolary fiction. It's metafiction. It's about a documentary film, but it's also about a handwritten book. It's also about the life of one of our narrators. So there's a lot going on. There are a lot of different perspectives here. So I'm going to take it from the beginning, which starts with an introduction by a man called Johnny Truant. He has found a handwritten manuscript, monograph, a handwritten book, and he found this in the home of a blind man who has died, and this man was called Sampagno. Sampagno has written a book which pretends at academia, I'll put it that way for now, about a documentary film called The Navidson Record. And in this manuscript, he discusses the film, he talks about the characters behind it, he analyzes the whole film. He kind of takes us through this documentary film. And he also brings in other kinds of material. So Sampagno does this. And he does that through footnotes. So at the core of the book, I would say, okay, backtrack. Okay. I hope you can tell that this is going to be complicated, but I'm working my thoughts out here in real time a little bit because I only finished it last night and I'm full of ideas. I want you to imagine House of Leaves like an onion with layers. At the heart of it are multiple different themes that I think every reader needs to figure out for themselves, but there are a number of layers which are clearly defined. So with this book, everything is a part of the story it tells. So, usually when you open a book, you have the publishing information at the front. This has already been formatted and designed to fit in with the book, because certain words in this book, for example, have a specific color. The word house, whether in English or in German or in French, is or should be in blue if you have the full color edition. If you have the black and white edition, I think it might be a slight gray. But the word house, for example, is always differentiated. My edition comes also from Random House, so the house in Random House and the publishing information at the front is already included in it. But we also find out about editors there. So there are people who have edited this book and brought it to you as a reader. That's kind of the most external layer. Then we encounter this introduction by our main narrator, I would say Johnny Truant. He has found a manuscript, and in his introduction, he does kind of tell us, like, I don't think you should be reading this. This is not good. It took over my life. I became obsessed by it. And we don't know until the end of the book just how obsessed he's become with it and how much this book has figured into his own kind of disassociation from the world and then breakdown, his own rediscovery of trauma. So that's the second layer, I would say, Johnny Truant, who has found this manuscript, this book. This handwritten book. Now that manuscript is by the man called Zampano, who I spoke about. Zampano wanted to write a book about the documentary film The Navidson Record, and that film, I would say, is one of the final layers, internal layers, of the onion that is House of Leaves. This film does not exist. It is a part of the fiction of the book, but in Zampano's book, in the manuscript that he has written, the film is real. It came out in 1993 and it came out in cinemas. People have written loads of articles and books about this. It's been discussed in scholarship, etc. So Zampano is trying to write an academic monograph on this film, analyzing it from the beginning to end, how it starts. And in doing so, he discusses psychology, different cinematic theories or film theories, and he talks about echoes and about mythology, and he's constantly quoting from sources, and these are all in footnotes. However, his monograph or his manuscript was something of a mess when Johnny Truant got it. So Johnny Truant is frequently also featured in the footnotes, where he either comments on something Zampano has written and says, well, this doesn't make sense, or he's looking for translations of French poems that Zampano is quoting, etc. And I'll get into the form a little bit more later. But we have at the heart this documentary film, which Johnny Truant himself is also trying to find evidence of as he's trying to finish this manuscript that he's almost kind of inherited, right? So we have these different layers and they work out in different ways across the page. But what you need to know plot-wise is that The Navidson Record is a documentary film by a man called Will Navidson, who is a photojournalist. He, his partner, and their 2 children moved to, I believe it was Virginia, and they have bought a house there, and that's where they now want to kind of start their life. Like, he's left his career behind a little bit because he and his partner do really want to kind of reconnect and really be a family. But, you know, he's a photojournalist, he loves filming, he loves taking photos, but they're kind of settling in until doors start appearing in blank walls, and these are walls that face outside. So behind that wall is the garden, but now suddenly there's a door, and behind that door is something dark and endless, just corridors upon corridors and stairs and halls, and it is a cold, dark place. There's not a single window in that space. And what do you do? So obviously Will Navidson starts filming. He brings in friends of his that he knows. He brings his brother in, and they start trying to figure out what this mysterious maze is, this darkness that has suddenly appeared in their house, right? And the film kind of tracks the ways in which this works. It's definitely horror inspired. There are a lot of content warnings one could apply here. But not just to that horror in the house, which Will Navidson is is exploring in the documentary, but also in what Sampaio is writing about as he brings in these different theories, etc. And then there is the horror of Johnny Truant's own life, his own trauma and difficulties, which keep interjecting in the footnotes. So in the footnotes, Johnny Truant, as he's finishing up this manuscript, he is telling his own life story, which is drug-fueled, sex-fueled, and he explores his own past of living in foster families, and there is so much going on here. But I hope I have now given you a bit of an idea of the different layers of this book. So we have metafiction, we have different frameworks, we have stories being told within stories. And that is not something that only House of Leaves does. Metafiction and framework narratives are a staple, I would say, of modern literature. I mean, and not even just modern literature, even if you look at something like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, she uses frameworks. The novel starts with letters from a captain to his sister, and then in those letters, we then get the story of Frankenstein, the doctor who created his creature. And then within that narrative, we get the creature himself explaining his life, right? So loads of novels work with different frame narratives, and many books also play with an edge of meta-narrative. So it might be useful just briefly describing maybe what a meta-narrative or what metafiction is. A basic definition of it is a book, usually, but it can also be a film or other kinds of art, which emphasizes its own structure and its own fictionality. So a book that is always reminding you that it is a book. Think, for example, of The Princess Bride. I haven't read the book, I've only seen the film, but that film, at least, and from what I know about the book, it's true there as well, is constantly talking about, this is a book, this is a version of this tale that I'm telling. You can find, I think, an unabridged version here. I'm only telling you the important parts. This is a story. This is a book. You're being entertained, right? So that's the kind of metafiction angle. It's fiction about fiction. It's books about the act of writing a book, of reading a book, etc. And House of Leaves does that as well. But the main thing I find fascinating about House of Leaves is that it's not just metafiction. It is also something which is called ergodic literature. I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but ergodic literature is a term which originated with Espen J. Aarseth in his book Cybertext Perspectives on Ergodic Literature. And this is about books about literature which requires a lot of effort for readers to read. And this is where I'm going to move away from what this book might be about to what it requires of you as a reader. So, as I said, there are different layers to this book, right? And we have different voices, we have different perspectives that are being given to us. And at the beginning, this is mainly Sampaio, Johnny Truant, and the editors. And none of these people have ever met. They are only connecting with each other through the text, right? And what is really interesting is that all of these different voices are giving different fonts. So Elise Hawthorne has written a blog post to which I'll link called Font Functions in House of Leaves, in which she lays out the different fonts that are being used for these different voices. So Johnny Truant, with whom we start, his narrative is written or presented at least in a Courier font, which looks very much like something an old school typewriter might give you. And it's a bit larger as well, and it just gives a certain vibe to his words that feel a little bit rushed, but he is in Courier and quite a large font size, I would say. The manuscript that he is editing, that is being presented to us, that was written by Sampaio, is in Times New Roman, which is a font that often gets overlooked, but which I myself now use for my academic writing, because it's just, it's so common, it's so accepted, and it looks quite clean on the page, I would say, and it looks traditional, which makes sense for what the book is trying to be, which is an academic book about a film. Then we have in the footnotes, not just Johnny Truant's footnotes in Courier, we also have these editor comments. And they are, says Elise's blog post, in Bookman typeface. And of course, editors, Bookman, it suggests a certain kind of distance maybe, but also a sense of authority, because when they come in, they're always quite judgmental of something either Johnny Truant has done or Zampano, right? So I would say for the first fifth of the book, those are the main three fonts that you get to see. And that is also the main work you have to do, because in the body of the text there will be footnotes, and they will refer you either just to this quote comes from this article, which is usually made up. And then, however, at the end of that footnote, there might be another footnote, which is Johnny Truant's comments, who, for example, says something like, I tried to find this article and I can't find it. Attached to that may be another footnote from the editors who say, well, he couldn't find it and neither could we. It might not exist, right? So there is dialogue happening in the footnote section. This can be quite confusing. I'm someone who reads a lot of academic literature, obviously, so I'm used to footnotes, endnotes, in-text citations, etc. I've had to learn, because I'm in academia, how to read through that, or how to read with it, rather, to move from the top of the page quickly to the bottom to check a footnote and then move back up to where the main text is. So that is something that, in a way, was quite easy for me. But it might be quite challenging for readers who don't usually read texts with a lot of footnotes, right? Because you have to interrupt your story to figure out some information, which might just be a question mark. It might not actually help you understand what has just happened. In fact, in House of Leaves, it will usually complicate what you've just read. So that is, for, like I said, the first fifth of the novel, that is mostly what you have to deal with. And then you'll be caught by the word house being in blue, for example. You'll be like, okay, I'm starting to get used to this. And because the tone shifts as well, you have to constantly adjust your own mindset to the book as well. Because when you're reading the manuscript as it's being presented, well, that is meant to be an academic book. So it feels a bit dry at the beginning. And I think this is on purpose. And even I had to struggle through it, where I was like, I do not know if I care about this, Zampano. But when you then switch to the footnotes, where Johnny Truant is talking about his life and about a party he went to with his best friend, or a stripper that he's fallen in love with, or the tattoo joint where he works, you're like, okay, wait, this is a completely different type of writing. This is almost autobiographical. So you then need to shift your expectations. And then before you know it, you're back in a really dry academic text talking about, well, psychology or architecture, etc. And this back and forth at the beginning, I think, is meant to, on the one hand, get you used to playing with the book, letting the book take you where it wants to take you, and also just acquainting you with the fact that you are on unstable ground, because you cannot quite trust where this book is going. You cannot trust that Zampano knows what he's talking about in his manuscript, that Johnny Truant has any idea what's going on, or that the editors really know where either of these men wanted to go with their stories, right? So that's how you spend the first fifth, I would say. And now I'm going to do my best to describe how 2 pages look. So bear with me here. I'm just going to move this microphone over slightly. Okay. So I was reading, I'm also leafing through the book in case you hear some weird things. So I was reading through it, and then at a certain point I was like, oh, one of these footnotes is in a blue box about, near the top of the page. I was like, interesting. It's always nice to see some color. This is also just as they start exploring the weird labyrinth in the documentary that the manuscript is about, that Johnny Truant is editing, right? So I was like, I see you, Danielewski. You're playing with format, because I knew it was going to do that. I didn't expect how much the next 2 pages, well, the next 4, 5, 6 pages would complicate my life and the reading experience. So I saw this little blue box and I thought, excellent. So I flipped to the next page. The same blue box appears near the top, but the writing inside of it is now reversed. And initially I was like, wait, is this new text that I'm meant to be reading? And then I was like, oh no, this is bleeding through, between quotation marks, from the previous page. It's like the mirror image, so I don't need to read that. But then I was like, okay, on the left side of the left page, if you've got a book open in front of you, there is a footnote. This is footnote 146. We're only on page 120. There's a lot of footnotes in this book. There's a footnote which is just names of buildings that are architecturally interesting to Zampano, apparently. And it just stretches down the entire left side of the book, taking up, I would say, almost half, maybe just between a third and a half of the page. On the rest of the page, we have the text of the manuscript in Times New Roman, kind of just flowing, explaining things. And then at the bottom again, we have some extra footnotes, because you can never have too many footnotes, right? And I was like, okay, this is a bit confusing, but I can see where this footnotes with all the names of buildings, I can see where that is meant to be relevant. I'm not going to read through all of them. I'm not going to check if they will exist. I'm cool with it. This chapter is clearly about architecture, so the buildings are relevant. Then I look to the right page from where my book is open. On that right-hand side of that right page, there is, again, a column of footnotes stretching down the page vertically. Only here, the writing is upside down. And it is the end of a footnote, which does not start until 4 or 5 pages later. So it's just a list of names, and I don't know what these names are for. They don't feel relevant, but they're just running down the side of my page. On the left side of the page, again vertically, so I have to tilt my head to the left, there is a footnote. In the center, there is the text of the manuscript, at the bottom more footnotes, and again, in the sort of right-hand side top, is a blue box, where the footnotes that started on the previous page is continuing. So what I'm doing as I'm looking at these 2 pages is I'm tilting my head. I'm trying to find where these footnotes are in the main text. I'm trying to figure out if I need to flip the book around, which then I did have to, because I needed to figure out what this upside down footnote was about. And that is how it goes on for multiple pages. And these footnotes on the sides just keep going, and they keep listing names, and the blue boxed footnote at the top of the page just keeps going and bleeding through and echoing. It feels like a corridor through the book. And I'm like, okay, is this what they're feeling like in this weird maze-like labyrinth in the documentary film that we're talking about? And I was intrigued. And at a certain point, my neck started hurting. So I had to readjust my grip. And footnotes just keep shifting places, shifting directions. Johnny Truant brings in a massive footnote talking about a girl that he made out with. And I'm like, okay, excellent. But what is happening here? One page is just footnotes. There is no main text. And then that part of the page just turns empty because the main text needs to wait until the footnotes have caught up with each other. And then text starts being crossed out in red, and I'm just kind of leafing through it. And the page starts becoming quite empty here or there as certain elements of text fall away. And after this, I had to take a break. And I'm telling you this in such explicit detail because I think it's a crucial part of knowing what you're in for with this book. Right? And I think when you first see it, you think, oh, that's super cool. If you're into books that play with you, you think, oh, that's super cool. And then you underestimate the effort it requires. The frustration I felt trying to find where certain footnotes were meant to go, when I was like, why is footnote 149 only being referenced now when at the bottom of the page we're already at footnote 158? How does that work? Why is there a random check mark here? Where is that check mark meant to go? Am I meant to understand this, or am I meant to just go with it, right? So House of Leaves plays with the effort that you need to put in to reading, and that is why it's, I think, a perfect example of ergodic literature, literature that highlights the effort of reading. And I would argue that for much of the book, that is part of the pleasure. At times it is frustrating, and I think that is meant to echo the frustration that the people that are exploring the house are feeling, that Zampano perhaps is feeling while trying to create this manuscript, because he is blind, so he has never seen the documentary film he's purportedly writing about, and he has people writing things for him, etc. And it's also the frustration that Johnny Truant is feeling, trying to figure out this manuscript and get it into a proper order while his own life is falling apart and he's feeling haunted by his own past. So it really adds to the reading experience. There are a couple of moments where it works extremely well, however, and there it has less to do with footnotes and frameworks, etc., and more with how the text is laid out across the page. There are moments where there's only a single word on the page, for example, where you're racing through the pages, and every time you have to turn the page, it's like you have to take a breath, you have to take a next step. And that is again echoing experiences that the characters are having, and especially moments of tension and drama where potentially dangerous things are happening. That delayed reading experience that is created by that works really well. There are moments where the writing is not kind of from top to bottom, but starts in a corner and spreads its way down the page that way. And there are so many moments where you have to turn this book upside down, flip it to the side, open it up real wide to make sure you can read a word that is falling into the margins, right? And yeah, that just brings across the experiences of what is happening within the text really well. And because of that, I found myself engrossed in this book in a way I'm not with books that are laid out normally, if that makes sense. So I've been reading a lot of, for example, fantasy, romantasy books lately, just to kind of get some entertainment in and to have fun with a friend, etc. And I'd noticed over the past week or two that I was reading too quickly, that I was racing through sentences, jumping over sentences where I was like, oh, and now this happens, okay, I can jump to the next paragraph. I was speed reading, and sometimes speed reading is absolutely fine. Sometimes that is what you want to do. Sometimes you just want to get the general gist. But I was losing touch with the fun part of reading, with diving into the nuances of a text. And that was my cat who just jumped off the table. And House of Leaves does not support quick, casual reading. It requires you to pay very close attention to the way something looks, the way it is written, to the placement of a certain piece of information on a text. And because of that, I really had to slow down. And I incorporated this book almost into my daily routine, where I knew, okay, after I've had dinner, I'm going to brush my teeth, and then I'm going to lie down in bed and read this book until my head explodes. And throughout the day, I would be thinking like, okay, and tonight I'm going to keep reading, and I'm going to keep exploring, and I'm going to find out what is happening in this house. I'm going to find out what is happening in Zampano's manuscript, and I'm going to find out what is up with Johnny Truant and his mess of a life. And it was propulsive in a way. And I think this book has spawned something of a fandom of its own, and I do understand that. I think this is a book where if you reread it, you're going to now discover little elements you hadn't before. The check mark I mentioned earlier that just randomly appears at a certain point, I didn't understand what that was for until I reached one of the appendices. And that's another thing, this book has appendices. It has random poems attached to it. There are collages and drawings. And it's a puzzle that you get to explore. And because of that, it is an incredibly immersive reading experience. I would therefore also say, and I've seen this in some reviews, which I kind of looked around a little bit at how people responded to this book after I finished it. And I've seen that for some people, that effort that is required feels like too much. And I don't want to judge that in any way, because it is a book that requires a lot of effort, and it is a puzzle game you need to be up for. I don't think there's a point to reading this book if you're not willing to play its game. And I'm usually never one to tell people to not read a book. I think we should all read whatever books we want. But I think with this book, if you just read it for what is happening, if you just read it for the bare bones plot, you're going to miss what this book is for. I think you can make the argument that its format and its structure and the way that it is set up is perhaps at times a bit, I don't necessarily want to say pretentious, but that is where I'm going, I guess. Like I can appreciate that the complexity can feel like complexity for complexity's sake, you know? But I think the story itself and the themes that House of Leaves is playing with are strong enough to still stand up, even despite all the noise around it, all the footnotes, all the upside down text, all the flipped vertical, horizontal, diagonal ways in which the book plays with you. I think it still stands up, and I think the reading experience that you have, because of all the work you're putting in, makes it very compulsive. But you have to be willing to play the game. If you just want to read this in order to kind of know what it's about, then I don't think you're going to have a good time with it. The book is 500, 600, 700 pages long. That is too much book to work through if you don't want to enjoy the work. But I would say that if you want to see how fiction can play with you, how writing can have an effect on you as the reader, I think it's basically that. Then House of Leaves is an excellent read to dive into. You have to be a little wary of the dark, a little wary of the rabbit holes it might take you down. But yeah, I found it fascinating as an experience. I think this whole episode is me literally trying to work through my feelings, so I hope that some of that is useful to anyone considering potentially picking this book up. There are general content warnings potentially to this book. The book kind of plays with that itself when it talks about how the Navids and Records, so the documentary, is often taken as a horror film by the academics that the book quotes. And so it does play with elements of agoraphobia, claustrophobia. This is echoed by how the text is formulated. There are moments where like my heart was beating because I was racing, or where there was so much empty space on a page and I was frantically looking for the one word or the one footnote that was going to tell me what was going on. So it does work with that. It also works with issues of drug addiction, trauma, abuse. There's a lot of sex and violence in the book as well. It's definitely a book for adults. And that is echoed by how difficult it can be to read. But I'm very glad to have read it now. It was staring at me from across the room for months. And I was just looking for a moment where my brain was capable of fully dedicating to it. And I'm very glad that that has now come. And now I'm a little bit sad about it being over. But on the other hand, I think there are so many aspects of the book that I potentially missed in my first reading, just because of how complex its structure and format is. So that I will definitely have to reread it at some point. But maybe I need to crack open a window and let some light in before I delve back into the darkness and the non-Euclidean geometry of the maze that is House of Leaves. If you have read this book, I would love to know what you think. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Quick Central.